Now that we've looked at Blake's background, we need to look more closely at Blake's own often confusing and sometimes very convoluted ideas and the ideology behind Blake's poetry and his conception of his poetic universe that he creates in all of his poems. And once again, it's important to keep in mind that this is like the fictional universe that is constructed in a movie franchise where various characters weave in and out of different stories, and they're generally the same set of characters, but sometimes they can change their personalities from one movie to the next. They can be a good guy in one, bad guy in another. They can be colleagues in one, and Iron Man and Captain America, mortal enemies in another, or Captain America and the Winter Soldier. Sorry, I'm way too familiar with the Marvel Universe, I suppose. So we'll be looking at what Blake believes and how that set of beliefs shapes his poetry. And I hope that it will help you gain a more concrete conception of what's going on in these poems and be able to appreciate them. Okay, so now let's look at Blake's confusing, convoluted, and admittedly inconsistent ideology. Now, Blake experts themselves are confused about what's going on in Blake. So I don't think that you should necessarily be upset if you feel confused as well, since you've got good company with the actual experts. Blake's ideology is confusing for two reasons. The first one is that he himself is a very complicated man, that he has a very complicated set of ideas, and that the only way he can express them is through this set of convoluted images. But there's also a practical reason that he's so confusing, and that is because he sort of has to be. During this particular time in English history, England is threatened with daily popular revolution. England is afraid that it is going to suffer what is happening to France and is tearing France apart, which is an attempt to overthrow the monarchy and establish a democratic government, along with a lot of destruction and bloodshed. And as a result of that, the Crown has suspended habeas corpus. Now, habeas corpus is the legal doctrine that says that if you are imprisoned, a lawyer or a representative can go to a judge and obtain a writ of habeas corpus, which means that they need to either charge you with a specific crime from which you can defend yourself or let you go. When habeas corpus is suspended, it means that the Crown, the government in this case the Crown, can throw you into prison for any reason whatsoever, not tell you why, and they don't have to let you go until they feel like it, if they ever do. Now, the main reason that habeas corpus is suspended is because they want to capture and detain potential revolutionaries without having to justify why. And this is a threat to Blake because in England, they have a national religion. The head of the Church of England is the King of England. And so from Blake's perspective, treason not only means going against the King of England or deliberately trying to overthrow the government, but also making statements that could contradict the dogma of the Church. If you made a statement or expressed a belief that contradicted the dogma of the Church, you could be charged with treason. And the consequences of being charged with treason could be quite serious. As you certainly know if you've read the head note, Blake himself was in fact tried for treason. A soldier was rifling through Blake's garden. As you may know, in England, the government could quarter the military upon civilians without their consent. So a government was rifling through Blake's garden, and Blake, furious, chased him from the garden and back down to the barracks. In the meantime, shouting at him and most likely saying things that could be interpreted as treasonous. Well, the soldier filed a complaint. Blake was arrested and tried for treason, and was, fortunately for him and for us, he was found innocent and released. But the consequences could have been dangerous. Had he been found guilty, he could have been hung. He could have been hung for what he was yelling at the soldier, and at best he could have been transported. He could have been sent to Australia, which would have been seen by the English as almost a death sentence at that particular time in history. So there's a real reason that Blake needs to costume his complex belief system in an impenetrable symbolic structure as a form of political protection. So first we need to look at Blake's take on the notion of the Bible and his conception of God. Now, Blake doesn't read the Bible as a literal and historical representation of early Christianity, the way, in fact, that the church wants it to be seen. Rather, he sees it as a symbolic truth, an allegorical representation of the evolution of human society, reading it very much like an allegory like the Fairy Queen or Pilgrim's Progress. It's a story that represents through symbols how human society evolved. So he also sees God very differently. The traditional conception of God, of course, is an all-powerful, white, bearded being living in floating around on clouds in heaven, as opposed to his enemy, Satan, the fallen angel who has been condemned to hell. And Blake doesn't see it that way at all. That's not Blake's conception. In fact, he believes that both of these images are human creations. Blake believes that humans have taken important human characteristics and divided them up in between two separate characters, God and Satan, and then labeled one set as good and one set as evil, when in fact both are necessary. So, according to Blake, humans have associated God with the soul and with the spirit, and the soul and the spirit is associated with a reason and restraint, while on the other hand, the body is associated with Satan and the desires of the body. And so the characteristics of energy, sensuality, the world of the senses, and desire is associated with Satan. But Blake himself doesn't believe that that's actually the case. He believes that these two things are actually two sides of a single being. They're human characteristics, and both are valid. And in fact, the closest thing I can think of how sort of Blake conceptualizes this is the Chinese image of the yin and yang, the two forces that are represented by fire and by ice, combining and both being necessary. And so this sort of yin and yang symbol becomes a relevant image for Blake's conception of how we should see these characteristics. We've separated between God and Satan and then condemned one set while valorizing. It's probably easiest to see what we're talking about in Blake by looking into Blake's illuminated text, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Now, before we actually start looking at the text, we should talk a little bit about what an illuminated text is, because if you see Blake's poems only in black and white printed on a page, as they're printed in the Norton Anthology, you're really seeing only half the story. It was very popular in the 18th century to distribute texts that they called illuminated texts, which we would think of as graphic novels, and in fact they were basically graphic novels or sophisticated adult comic books. A copywriter would write copy, would write a story, and then an engraver would create illuminations or illustrations of the story, and they sold very popularly. So anyway, what happened would be a copywriter would write the copy for the story, and then they would go to an engraver to create the illustrations. Or they would take an existing story like Milton's Paradise Lost and take it to an engraver who would create illustrations. And how the engraver would do this was that they would take a copper plate, and then they would coat the copper plate with a thin layer of wax, and then they would scratch into the wax with a sharp instrument images. And then they would coat the wax with a copper plate with acid, and the acid would eat into the copper plate at the places that were not protected by wax, leaving an image. And if they wanted to make a multi-layered image, they could then coat it again with wax and engrave it again, and then they could have basically relief carving. And then what would happen, or they could, have different line weights and things like that. Then what would happen was they would heat the copper plate, the wax would roll off, and then they would roll it with ink, wipe the ink off the top, leaving it in the engraving left by the acid, and then put a piece of paper on it and then use a roller to push the paper into the engraving, and it would pick up the ink. This is exactly how, if you order engraved invitations, engraved wedding invitations or party invitations now, this is how they do it. Only they use technology. They don't use acid and copper plates anymore. But it's basically the same idea. And this is how Blake made his living. Blake was an engraver, and he had several famous engravings. In fact, if you were an art history major rather than an English major, you would be studying Blake very likely in an art history class, because for art historians, he was an artist rather than a poet. But he is now also famous as a poet, although his poetic fame didn't really originate until much later, even the beginning of the 20th century. So anyway, if you are looking at these plates, one of the things you should be aware of is that Blake not only wrote these poems, but he also engraved them. And by the way, when you engrave them, you have to engrave them in reverse, because when you push the paper, they're going to pick the ink up. So everything has to be written out in reverse, in the mirror image of how it will appear on the final thing. So he engraved these texts, and then he and his wife hand colored them with watercolor, which was an incredibly laborious process, which means there's not very many copies of these texts running around. If you want to see some, they have several versions of the Songs of Innocence and Experience in the Huntington Museum in San Marino, up near Pasadena. And they usually have at least one and sometimes several on display. And you can go up and see one that Blake himself and his wife, he engraved himself, he himself printed, and then he himself hand colored, and then bound together and distributed. So back to the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. So this is an illustrated text, and in this particular text, he is providing what he describes as a parody of the Bible. Now the idea is that there is already a Bible, and he wants to create the Bible of hell, because we're only getting half the story. Remember that heaven and hell are not, as traditional Christianity have seen them, good and bad places necessarily. They're just different places. One characterized by reason and the other characterized by energy. And so we already have the Bible of heaven, the Bible. Blake is giving us the other side of the story, the Bible of hell. So we are now looking at one of the plates from the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. The Marriage of Heaven and Hell and the Songs of Innocence and Experience, because they are both printed on these plates, they're called plates because they're engraved plates of copper. Rather than calling them pages, they're called plates. And if you look in the Norton Anthology, you'll see at intervals during the text, it will say plate 1, plate 2. That's because these are where the original pages break over. And so right now we are looking at plate number 4 of the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And I'm sorry that you can't see where it says plate number 4 because it's hidden behind me. But this is plate number 4. It appears on page 160 of your Norton Anthology. That's page 160. You can go look at this text if you're interested. So what this particular plate is saying is, first, it's offering us the traditional image of religion, the way that the Bible represents it, the original Bible, not this parody Bible. First, it says that man has two existing principles, the body and the soul. And then it goes on to say that in traditional Christianity, the body is associated with energy, and those things associated with the body are called evil. And on the other hand, reason is associated with the soul, and those things that are associated with the soul are called good. But the devil goes on to say in his parody that the contraries of these two statements are also true, that the body and soul are really two integrated parts of the same being, that the body is only that portion of the soul that is manifested through the senses, and that energy is associated with the body. And so energy is absolutely necessary. You can't have reason without energy. And this is going to be important to keep in mind when we get to the Songs of Innocence and Experience, because one of the important points to keep in mind is, as Blake will say later, and we'll look at this, without contraries there is no progression. So you need to understand that according to Blake's ideology, as it's expressed here, both the reason and the reason that's associated with the soul and the energy associated with the body are necessary in order to move forward. Blake's next important concept is how he sees human society. And so we'll need to look at the evolution of modern human society as Blake sees it represented symbolically in the Bible. In the Bible, in the beginning, there was this original creation, Adam, or what Blake calls Albion. And For Blake, Adam is a symbolic representation of human society, of original human society, existing at a time of perfect sympathy. Everyone within this human society associated with Eden is perfectly sympathetically bonded with everyone else. Everyone is completely altruistic. The word alter from Latin means other, and altruistic means other-centered. And that means that they don't need laws and rules in order to govern their behavior. No one would ever hurt anyone else because they identify with other people's pain. And so I'm not going to do something that will injure you in some way because injuring you will injure me. And for Blake, that's the original state of Eden, inhabited by this person, place, Albion. But then the fall occurs. The fall for Blake, which is represented in the Bible by Adam taking the bite of the apple, which was Adam's crime of prioritizing self over other. Adam's bite of the apple was selfish. He was doing something for himself. This crime of selfishness creates the fall, the felix culpa of traditional Christian ideology, which is a fall for Blake into division. And this is where it really gets confusing. In Blake's cosmology, this fall creates this fall of division into what he calls the four Zoas. The four Zoas are these four separate beings who are in the sympathetic world represented by Adam or Albion, but now have been divided into these four separate alienated beings. And then they fall farther into the next set as the Zoas separate from the Zoas and their female emanations. So anyway, the Zoas and their female emanations. And then those beings all separate further into specters. And so ultimately, Blake's universe is inhabited by a group of beings separated from one another. They all become divided into these separate alienated groups away from the original sympathetically bonded, unified Albion. If you understand the conception of a universal state of sympathy in which individuals are bonded together, represented by the symbolic Albion, it makes it easier to understand Blake's different levels of existence that he believed characterize human society at different points in history. For Blake, the original state, the state occupied by Albion, is Eden, a place of universal sympathy and peace, a paradise. Underneath Eden is Beulah. Beulah is an area of innocence. Beulah is a place of innocence, or a state of society characterized by innocence. Not as perfect as Eden, but still there's a level of sympathy and mutual understanding. Below that is generations. Generations is a world of experience where there is greater alienation and a loss of sympathy. And then below that is hell, the space of perfect alienation and separation. So these are the four different states that Blake characterize human society and which he represents in his poems. Now, these four different states, the way Blake sees it is that we are, throughout human history, alternating between these states, cycling up and down this ladder of alienation or sympathy. So for Blake, alienation is what drives us down toward hell. As there's greater alienation, we go toward hell. Blake might believe that 21st century society that we occupy now is approaching, if has not reached, Ulro. On the other hand, cultivating sympathy accomplishes the other. Cultivating sympathy then helps move us back up toward the sympathy of Eden. Now, we're never going to get to Eden. Eden is a state that we lost with the fall. We're never going to be able to give away that notion of separation or get rid of that notion of separation, but we can at least go back toward Beulah. And then once again, it's important to notice that, or know that Blake sees human society throughout history as cycling between these different states. During relative peacetime, we might be in an era of Beulah. During times of war, we're in an area of Ulro. So the goal is to foster sympathy in order to help push us back up toward as Edenic a state as we can possibly accomplish. So ultimately, fostering sympathy will help save humanity. That's Blake's goal, is to help foster sympathy. So the next important concept is Blake's concept of human institutions and how they work in relation to the fostering of sympathy or the sowing of alienation and discord. In Blake's ideology, one of the problems with our society is the human institutions we've created to help us avoid problems. So things like law and religion are ultimately the source of our problems. One of the problems, he says, is institutional religion. Now, he is not attacking religious belief. Blake himself is a deeply religious man. But he does attack the church because he believes that institutionalized religion has actually gotten in the way of religious belief. And we'll be talking about this in more detail later, but it's important to keep in mind that during this particular time and throughout the 19th century, the church has come under attack as a place where the aristocracy stores their younger sons in case they're needed to take over the estate in case their older brothers die. The aristocracy, the aristocrats, have estates, and the estates encompass not only the places where they live, but also all the villages on their land, including the churches in those villages. And so they have control over who gets to be the ministers of those churches. And they're called livings. The minister of a church gets what is called a living. Having the living of a church means that you are the minister of that church and you get your income from that church. Now, the way that a patriarchal, patrilineal society works is that property is passed on from father to son. And so it's important that you have lots of sons, because in this particular point in history, infant mortality rates are about 80%, which means that there's only a 20% chance that your sons are going to survive to adulthood. And so you need to have lots of sons, so you have extras in reserve, just in case some of them don't survive. And so you have these sons, you have the son, and you have your backup son, and you have your backup son. Now, the problem is that when you die, you're going to pass your estate on to your number one son. You don't want to split it up between all your sons because that would destroy the estate. So what do you do with your other sons, the ones who are not the heirs to your estate? And how do you keep them prepared in case they should become the heir to your estate? Well, what you do is you educate them and you put them into the church. And so, because being a minister, you're still a gentleman if you're a minister and you're well educated, and also you're prepared to take on responsibility. So what they would do is they would educate their children to be ministers. They would give them the living of the church on their estate, or if they have too many sons and not enough churches, or if they don't have a church on their estate, you can buy the living from someone else who has a church on their estate but no son to put in it. And you give them money, and then they allow you to install your son as their minister. And some ministers had multiple livings. They could have the living of 3 separate churches. And they'd hire some poor curate who would then perform all of the actual churchly duties. They would deliver the service on Sunday, and they would visit the sick, and they would comfort the old, etc., etc. And you would pay them a pittance, and then as the minister, you would get the income, and you get the income from 3 different churches. So you could live actually quite well. And many of these ministers, I mean, there are many ministers who were truly called to the ministry and were good people, but there were also very many who were using it as a way to get an income without having to work very hard. And this meant that the Church of England, was not serving the religious needs of the country. And many people were criticizing it for this, among them Blake. And so Blake, in this particular plate, is plate 11, which is on page 163 of the Norton Anthology, is talking about the origin of organized religion. And he says that basically it arises out of superstition, that the people invested all of the different features of their land with spirits, and then they began to worship these spirits. And then eventually these spirits became hardened into belief systems, and they became priests. And then they set these priests that they themselves had created above them, and then worshiped them, and then forgot that they had created the gods that they were worshiping, ignoring the true God in favor of their created gods, is Blake's notion here. And so the church is essentially, he argues, worshiping a human created God rather than the true God that it should worship. Prisons, also a famous plate. This is plate 8, page 162. He has the line that says, "Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion." So the institutions that are designed to somehow protect human society are actually creating its ills, according to Blake. And Blake, believing with Godwin, this was Godwin's belief in an inquiry concerning political justice, Blake believed that human institutions in a perfect society would be unnecessary. We wouldn't need law if we were all living together in sympathetic harmony, because no one would dream of hurting another person. We wouldn't need religion because we would all be practicing religion daily. So ultimately, the rules that come with law and with religion create the crimes and the sins that they then punish, according to Blake's belief. In other words, human institutions corrupt sympathy for Blake. So the next important concept is the role of the poet. How does the poet fit into this and help rejuvenate human society? And this is where we get toward the Songs of Innocence and Experience. As I mentioned earlier, Blake says at the beginning of the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, this is plate 3 on page 160, without contraries there is no progression. Attraction, repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human experience. These characteristics that are divided up and some are labeled good and some are labeled evil are all essential. And the role of the poet is to help bring these things together, to unify these contraries, to create progression. Now, this takes us to the Songs of Innocence and Experience. And when you read these poems, one of the things you're going to notice, and we'll be looking at in the Songs of Innocence and Experience, are the characteristics that characterize each of these two states. Innocence is characterized by cheerfulness and joy, by hopefulness and optimism, by harmony. The introduction to the Songs of Innocence is the piper piping down the mountains wild, piping songs of glee when all at once he saw a child and who appears on a cloud and says to him, "Piper, pipe a song of joy." And then the poem, The Lamb, has this little lamb who made thee, dost thou know who made thee? It has this sort of nursery rhymish quality, all about hopefulness and joy. One can imagine that when the piper sits down to write the song of joy, he writes the lamb. But the other side of innocence is also that people in a state of innocence are naive and they're blind. They're blind to the problems. And we'll see this in the chimney sweeper, and we'll talk about the chimney sweeper and what that means. But the obvious horror and injustice of children being sold into slavery to die in other people's chimneys, they're blind to this. They don't see it. And also they're passive. They sort of passively accept the circumstances, believing that if all do their duty, they need not fear harm, because ultimately they'll end up in heaven. Then on the other side of this, we have the Songs of Experience. The Songs of Experience characterized by the introduction to the Songs of Experience, where we're told to hear the voice of the bard, who present, past, and future sees, whose ears have heard the holy word that walked among the ancient trees. So this is a song of knowledge and experience, but it's also it's a voice of pessimism and cynicism, and of anger and conflict. The voice is not at all optimistic. But on the other side of that, this person is able to see the ills of society. They have realistic perception, and they have the energy to cure them. So the poem, The Tiger, which is the counterpart of the poem, The Lamb, has a tiger, 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 burning bright in the forest of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? So there's an uncertainty, but there's also a power and an energy there. And so the goal of the Songs of Innocence and Experience is to take these two contrary states, remember, without contraries there's no progression, and to unify them into innocence and experience. So we have a state of mind which is full of cheerfulness and joy, hopefulness and optimism and harmony, but also has realistic perception and energy. So they can see the problems of society, have the energy to correct those problems, and the optimism to believe that they may be corrected. As social theorist Antonio Gramsci says during World War II, he characterizes it as pessimism of the will, optimism of the intellect. And this is something that I think that Blake holds as well. So ultimately, the goal is to allow us to experience both these states of human society, and thereby help foster in us sympathy, so that he can satisfy his beginning to the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he says, without contraries, there's no progression.